Well, hello, online campus. Today, I want to take us back to a time to talk about something that happened about 100 years ago or so. So in the early 20th century, a remarkable transformation began to unfold in the realms of education, business, and even warfare. And at first, this change was subtle. Educators and trainers were constantly seeking more effective ways to share complex information, diagrams, and images to large groups of people. And to be real, the blackboard and all that screeching chalk noise just wasn't getting it done. So a new device was invented. And initially, it was a tool for military strategy and training, but soon it captured the attention of educators, business professionals, and yes, even churches across the nation. Take a look at this tech that revolutionized worship music in sanctuaries everywhere, including our very own Rainier Christian Church.
There's a lot of great new choruses out there that are not in your hymnal, and using an overhead projector in your worship ministry is a great way to expand the song library and keep things new and fresh. Here's a couple of tips to make your overhead projector ministry shine. Hey, it's Dave Dalton from the online website, www.practicalworshipblog, all one word, no spaces, .com. All you need to do is get on your computer, log on to the World Wide Web, and 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, we share tips and ideas and practical advice for the everyday worship leader. So when you're using an overhead projector in your worship ministry, there's a couple of things you want to have on hand at all times. The first thing is a Sharpie, because sometimes the lettering on these transparencies will flake off and you might not notice it until right before you need it and there's not enough time to make a new copy. You can take the Sharpie, fill in that missing letter or that missing word right before you need it, and you're good to go. Also, have a good cloth and some cleaner nearby. Finger smudges are going to happen no matter how careful you are, but if you keep your cleaning supplies really close by, it'll always keep your ministry clean and professional. And finally, I like to use a ruler. In fact, I tape it to the side of the machine so that when you are switching out the lyrics, you can line that up and the lyrics are straight every single time. Now, when you are running an overhead projector, you need to be ready for anything, and so organization is going to be key to that. We like to keep all of our songs in this file folder. Now, you can use a 3-ring binder, but if you do use a binder, I recommend that you put a piece of paper in between all the transparencies. Otherwise, if that binder gets too close to the heat of the projector, you're going to fuse those transparencies together, and then you got to do both songs at the same time. I don't know. But we keep all of our songs alphabetized in this file folder. Now, we do put all like the heavy rotation songs like Shine, Jesus, Shine, and Lord, I Lift Your Name on High. We keep those here at the front, really accessible. And then also those boom chink medley songs like Jehovah Jireh and I Will Celebrate and Blow the Trumpet in Zion. We keep all those together here in the back because it seems like every weekend that we do one of those medleys, there's always one song that the worship leader throws in that we did not practice. Now, a couple of ways to keep things professional. If you're the one running the overhead projector, I recommend the night before that you clip your fingernails, because if you're the one up there on a Sunday morning that's switching out the songs, your hands are up there for everyone to see, and so we want to make sure that our hands are well manicured to eliminate distractions. Also, you can use a piece of paper to cover up some of the words so you can focus on the section that you are singing, but it's not a necessity. And finally, if you need to make a copy, maybe as a backup or for the youth ministry, it's really important that you examine your slide carefully. If not, and you miss a finger smudge, it'll be there forever. So that's just a few ways to make the most of an overhead projector in your worship ministry. Here at Practical Worship, we love sharing ideas and tips and practical advice for the everyday worship leader. Join us next time as we look at the latest audio mixer from Mackie. Also, there is a brand new DC Talk Jesus Freak choir program that we'll check out, available now both in split track cassette and compact disc. In the meantime, we would love to connect with you online. Join us in our live chat room on America Online. Just use the keyword Practical Worship. And for more great practical advice, join us on the World Wide Web at www.practicalworshipblog.com.
So after watching that video, I immediately got self-conscious about my nails and their length, but we are good for today, I think. So we can keep recording. Now, if you haven't heard of the overhead projector, that's probably because you were born after the year 2000. But let me tell you, overhead projecting was all the rage back in the day. But imagine if, in the year of our Lord, 2024, we still use the OP for worship. What would you be thinking? Well, some of us might be down for that, but most of us would be confused and suggest that it's time for an upgrade. Why? Because now we have access to advanced technology that makes sharing information faster, easier, and way more engaging. For example, look behind me. Which is better, the overhead projector or that TV right there? Well, the question was rhetorical because the answer is obvious. The length of my nails does not impede the quality of that image. And we can change that image as much as we want, however we want. But I want to be clear about something. Just because modern tech makes the overhead projector obsolete doesn't diminish its historical significance. The overhead projector did exactly what it was meant to do. For its time, it was an innovative, essential, and it was a good for God's people and for Rusty's job. At the same time, if we never move on from the overhead projector, if we continue to rely on it for all our visual presentations, it would not only limit our effectiveness, but it would also hinder our ability to connect with and engage in today's digital world. Thank God for YouTube. And this is exactly what the author of Hebrews is getting at. Not about YouTube, but about this idea of moving forward. And he's talking with his first century audience. And what he wants to say is that the first covenant God established with his people was good, like the OP. It was time to move on, however, because something greater was now here. And the new covenant God offers to the world is built upon better promises. Now, these days, we don't really use that word covenant, but I think a good stand-in word would be a contract. And just as contracts are legal documents that name the terms and conditions of a relationship between two or more people, so too did the contract between God and Israel depend on certain requirements being met. But again, I want to caution us from thinking that the old contract, as we find it in the Old Testament, was a pain because there were requirements. Because no Jewish person thought of the contract between them and God like this. And in fact, King David even says this about the laws laid out in that covenant or contract. He says this in Psalms 19, 10 through 11. They are more precious than gold, than much pure gold. They are sweeter than honey from the honeycomb. By them your servant is warned. In keeping them there is great reward. The terms and conditions God had for his people, if they followed them, weren't meant to be a burden, but a blessing to Israel and their neighbors. Think about it this way. Do you believe in human rights? I hope that checkbox is going because you should. As in, do you think that someone else, no matter who they are, by just being human, deserves a certain level of dignity and respect? You should be typing in yes, that's the right answer. We all believe in human rights. But the question is, why do we believe in human rights? Why do we say it's a thing? It's not just an obvious thing that we all know innately, because throughout history we have examples of human communities and civilizations that don't believe in human rights. I want to propose that the reason why we say it's a thing, the reason why we say it's natural, the reason why we say it's so obvious is because someone introduced the idea to us about 3,000 years ago. And that someone was God. When God made his first covenant, his first contract with Israel, one of the requirements was for them to believe that God created everyone in his image, which meant Israel was expected to do justice and to care for even the foreigner, widow, slave, and orphan, the four types of people most folk in the ancient world considered trash. They were to consider them as being created in the image of God, as having dignity and worth. And so do you see how the rules of the old contract can be a blessing? If Israel believed God created and gave dignity to every person, and they stayed loyal to this God by worshiping him alone and committing themselves to loving their neighbor, well, what's the consequence or the byproduct of that? It would be a world filled with righteousness, justice, love, and peace, or shalom in the Hebrew. What I'm trying to get at is that the old covenant was good. The Old Covenant revolutionized the ancient Mediterranean world. The Old Covenant made it possible for a former group of slaves to become a people who are in and can continue to remain in relationship with God and partner with Him in blessing the world. And the author of Hebrews gets that. And he would never argue against that. The Old Covenant had its time and place, but what the author wants to point out is that there is now a better contract that God is offering. And it's so much better that it renders the old contract redundant, or in the words of the author himself, by calling this covenant new, He, God, has made the first one obsolete. And what is obsolete and outdated will soon disappear. So what makes the new covenant better? Well, let me revisit something I just said. The Old Covenant made it possible for a former group of slaves to become a people who are in and can continue to remain in relationship with God and partner with Him in blessing the world. That bolded part right there is the key to understanding the difference between the covenants. In the Old Covenant, God created a way for Israel to repair their relationship with Him when the eventual happened and people failed to live up to the contract, aka when they sinned. And that way involved the high priest. Once a year, the high priest would enter into the Holy of Holies, a room in the tabernacle or temple considered to be where heaven and earth met and where God was most present. And in that room, the high priest would offer animal sacrifices on behalf of his sin and the sin of the people. And because of this, Israel could remain in relationship with God. But as the author of Hebrew points out, as good as this process was, there were several downsides to this. If the high priest has to offer sacrifices for his own sin, well, we can't always rely on him year in and year out. And even if the high priest has his act together, the blood of animals only works once a year, so he has to re-up the contract annually. And in the best case scenario, you might get a high priest who faithfully serves his people for about 80 to 90 years, but guess what? They die, and you have to replace them. And it's not always guaranteed that the next guy you found on LinkedIn Premium will be any good at that job. So, the writer of Hebrews asks, wouldn't it be nice if there was a high priest who never sinned, who offered a sacrifice that was one and done, and who is not subject to death? Yeah, and Hebrews says we have one. This is what the author says. Now, the main point of what we are saying is this. We do have such a high priest, Jesus, who sat down at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, and who serves in the sanctuary, the true tabernacle set up by the Lord, not by a mere human being. Every high priest is appointed to offer both gifts and sacrifices, and so it was necessary for this one also to have something to offer. If he were on earth, he would not be a priest, for there are already priests who offer the gifts prescribed by the law, which is the Old Covenant. They serve at a sanctuary that is a copy and shadow of what is in heaven. That is why Moses warned when he was about to build the tabernacle, see to it that you make everything according to the pattern shown to you on the mountain. But in fact, the ministry Jesus has received is as superior to theirs as the covenant of which he is a mediator is superior to the old one, since the new covenant is established on better promises. That's a lot going on there. So let me just give you a breakdown of what the author is saying here. First of all, number one, Jesus is greater than the high priest. He is without sin. He has sacrificed his own life once and for all, and he has overcome death. Second point the author of Hebrews is making. The throne room is greater than the Holy of Holies. The HOH is a pattern shadow copy of the real thing, which is the throne room of God. But Jesus isn't in the replica. He's not in the shadow. He's not in the copy. Jesus is in the real thing and sitting at the right hand of God. And the third point the authors of Hebrews is making is that the new promise is greater than the old promise. The means by which we are kept in relationship with God is no longer dependent on the promise of imperfect priests, temporary sacrifices in a copy of the heavenly realms, but it is now secure in the promise of Jesus' ministry and his complete sacrifice, which takes place in the very real presence of God. The point is this: why settle for less when you can have what is greater? Now, we're not first century Jews, and so none of us are tempted to look back to the old covenant and long for what used to be. But if we can be honest with ourselves, there are plenty of modern promises outside of Jesus we buy into. For example, the promise of wealth says more money and more possessions can keep us safe and happy, and it doesn't. Or the promise of innovation says more progress and advancement will lead us to prosperity and peace. Well, it really hasn't. The promise of postmodernity says loosening our grip on what is true will lead to greater hospitality and tolerance. Maybe not so. And the promise of politics says more of our control and influence will make the world better, while the promise of religion says managing sins and being better people is our only hope and salvation. And that's just 5 examples. And here's the thing. We can laugh at first century folks all we want for clinging to the old covenants and promises and wanting them, but at least their old promises came from God. Our modern promises are self-made, and there has never been a time they have been good for us. If we read Hebrews and the only takeaway for us is, well, give up the old covenant and embrace the new, that's an easy call. None of us want to go back to priests, sacrifices, and temples. Nobody wants to see Rusty going in on our behalf sacrificing an animal. But the real message of Hebrews for us today is to realize that our modern promises, the 5 we named and the many that remain unnamed, cannot measure up to Jesus. We cannot have true joy, peace, safety, justice, and a world at rest and put to rights apart from Jesus. And the challenge is, can we get ourselves to acknowledge that? And will we live our lives differently considering that? This week, I want to challenge us to ask ourselves this question: what modern promise or promises are keeping us from the better promise provided and offered through Jesus? If you have not bought into following Jesus, but know all too well that something is missing in your life and all the promises you have trusted in are not working, I want you to consider that Jesus is the fulfillment of everything you have been looking and longing for. The one who will keep you safe, the one who will bring you peace, the one who will lead you into all truth, set your world right, and give you assurance that you are loved and have purpose is Jesus alone. And if you're open to learning more about him, if you are skeptical about his promises, if you have questions, we have an amazing opportunity coming up called Alpha in April, where we invite you to join a group of people who are exploring faith together. If you would like to learn more about this opportunity and receive some information and maybe even register, please type in Alpha into the chat box or in the comments, and one of us will connect with you to provide more information. And for those of us who already follow Jesus, maybe you're caught up in modern promises, and the tangible difference Jesus should be making in our lives is not showing up in any discernible ways. And I want to encourage you right now that that's not because you don't really believe or you don't really love Jesus, but simply that our modern promises have taught us to engage in certain habits or rhythms in life, and we need to get into the practice of new habits and rhythms Jesus invites us to. Those rhythms include daily engaging with God's Word, the Bible. It includes prayer. It includes worshiping with his community. It includes being overly and wildly generous. It includes confession and surrender. It includes serving our neighbors. And it also includes sharing the story of what God has done in our lives. And what I want you to do is just pick one of these to engage with more fully, asking God to help you see your next step or take a next step of discipleship that you know you need to grow in that is not on the screen of the things I just listed. And I want to remind you, we don't engage with these rhythms to be good enough for Jesus. We practice them because Jesus promises that they will be good for us. And by making these rhythms second nature, we will become people who look more like Jesus and who will live differently because of him.